I was looking at a standard world map this morning. You know, the political one with all the pastel color?
Oh, yeah, the classic classroom map.
Exactly. And it really struck me how incredibly deceptive it is. It looks so permanent, like a finished puzzle.
It creates this false sense of stability. It's very comforting, honestly. You look at it and you just think, okay, everything is in its designated box.
Right. You see the thick black line between France and Germany, or
Yeah,
the distinct shape of Brazil, and your brain just accepts it as absolute reality. Like, this is just the Earth.
but it's not.
No, it's really not. And if you dig into the source material we have today, which is a really comprehensive analysis of political geography, specifically looking at AP Human Geography topic 4.2, you quickly realize that map isn't a finished painting at all.
No, it's more like a paused video.
A paused video of a chaotic cage match, one that's been going on for centuries and honestly is arguably getting more chaotic today, not less.
That's a fantastic way to frame it because the lines we see aren't natural features. I mean, sure, sometimes they follow a river or a mountain range, but fundamentally, they are scars.
Scars.
Yeah, they represent where a power struggle stalled out, or where a treaty was hurriedly signed, or where a war finally ended. History, law, and social movements just constantly colliding.
And so that is our mission for this deep dive into the source material. We are going to decode the invisible forces that actually draw those lines, because it's not just about geography. It's about power, identity, and the rules of the global game.
And the sources break this down beautifully. When you strip away the flags and the national anthems, there are really three massive conflicting motivations driving the whole system.
Of the big three: sovereignty, the nation-state ideal, and self-determination.
Right. And the friction between those three concepts is basically what generates our daily news headlines. If you understand those three, you have the decoder ring for the world map.
Okay, so let's start with the big one: sovereignty. It sounds like a word from the 1600s, guys in powdered wigs signing parchment.
It does have that vibe.
But without the legalese, what are we actually talking about in a modern context?
At its core, sovereignty is the fundamental principle of the modern international system. It is the legal right of a state to control its own territory and govern itself without outside interference.
So the sources use this analogy of home ownership, which I think is helpful. It's like what happens inside your four walls is your business.
Exactly. You own the house, you make the rules inside the house.
But I had to push back on that a little bit
Yeah.
because even homeowners have to deal with like homeowners associations, right? Or city zoning codes. Does any country actually have absolute sovereignty anymore?
That is the big debate right now. In theory, yes, that's the classic model. The sources point to countries like the United States and France as prime examples of states exercising full sovereignty.
Because they have defined boundaries and the military capacity to actually defend them.
Right. They can completely determine their internal affairs. But you're right to be skeptical. In a heavily globalized world, sovereignty gets complicated by international law and trade agreements.
But the claim to sovereignty is what matters. It's the ultimate keep-out sign on the lawn.
Precisely. It's the legal shield.
Okay, so that gives us the container, the state, but then we have these other terms that people just throw around interchangeably, even though the sources are very clear that it means something completely different. The nation.
Oh, this is the single biggest point of confusion for most people.
Yeah.
We use country, state, and nation like they are synonyms. They are not.
So break it down for us.
A state is a political organization. It's the government, the bureaucracy, the physical lines drawn on the map. A nation is entirely different. A nation is a group of people,
It's cultural.
highly cultural. It's a group that shares a common identity. That could be a shared language, a shared history, ethnicity, religion, or heritage.
So just to clarify, the Kurds would be a nation.
Absolutely. The Kurds are a massive nation, millions of people with a deeply shared cultural identity. But they do not have a state.
They don't have the lines on the map.
Right. Which brings us to the hybrid term we use all the time, the nation state.
And based on the analysis here, the nation state is actually kind of unicorn.
It is an ideal, not the norm. The technical definition of a nation state is a political organization where the borders of the state align perfectly with a distinct cultural or ethnic group, the nation.
So the container perfectly matches the people inside it.
Yes. But in reality, in our very multi-ethnic world, true nation states are incredibly rare.
The sources cite Japan and Iceland as examples.
Those are the classic textbook examples. In Japan, you have the geographic boundaries of the islands, governed by the Japanese state, and populated almost entirely by the ethnic Japanese nation.
It lines up perfectly.
But for almost everywhere else, it's messy. You have states with dozens of different nations inside their borders, or you have one nation spread across 5 different states.
And that mismatch brings us to the third big concept, the engine of change, self-determination.
This is where things get volatile. Self-determination has its roots in Enlightenment philosophy, but it really gained massive traction after both world wars.
It's basically the belief that people who identify as a nation have the right to form their own independent state.
Exactly. If you are a distinct people, you should get to rule yourselves. You should get your own sovereignty.
Which, sounds amazing on paper. Everyone loves the idea of freedom and self-rule. But if you take that to its logical conclusion, there's a serious math problem here.
Massive math problem.
Because how many nations are there in the world? Thousands.
Easily thousands of distinct ethno-linguistic groups.
And there are roughly, 200 recognized states?
Give or take, yes. So the map simply cannot accommodate everyone. When you have thousands of groups all driven by the desire for self-determination, trying to carve out their own sovereign state, you get immense conflict. This is the force that constantly pushes to increase the number of countries on the map.
Okay, so if everyone actually followed this nation-state ideal from the beginning, the world map would look completely different.
Unrecognizable.
But they didn't. Because for a huge chunk of history, the people actually drawing the lines didn't care about the local nations at all. They were looking at resources and global power.
Which brings us to the historical forces that basically hijack the map. Imperialism and colonialism.
The sources make a careful distinction between those two terms, which I found really helpful.
Yeah, it's an important nuance. Imperialism is the broad concept of one country dominating another, politically or economically. Colonialism is the specific physical act of claiming the land, occupying it with settlers, and extracting its wealth.
And the most egregious example of this top-down map drawing has to be the scramble for Africa in the 19th century.
Without a doubt, it is the textbook definition of superimposed boundaries. You had European powers literally sitting in a room at the Berlin Conference.
Just a bunch of guys looking at a map of a continent they barely understood.
Literally drawing straight lines with rulers. They were carving up territories based entirely on their own economic needs. Access to a river, a copper deposit, a coastline.
They completely ignored the realities of the indigenous people living there.
Completely. And the specific example the analysis highlights here is tragic, the Somali nation.
Right, because this wasn't just a random group of people. This was a highly distinct ethnic group.
Yes, the Somali people shared a language, a religion, a deep cultural heritage. They were a clear, unified nation. But those lines drawn in Europe arbitrarily split them up.
Into 5 different pieces, right?
Yes. You had British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, and then large chunks of the Somali population were just absorbed into the borders drawn for Ethiopia and Kenya.
So even today, long after those colonial powers left, the impact is still there. We have an independent state of Somalia, but you still have ethnic Somalis living across the borders in Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Kenya.
And that fuels ongoing generational conflict because the lines don't match the people. It creates this constant pressure, what we call irredentism, where a country wants to reclaim territory that is populated by its own ethnic group.
It's a perfect example of how colonial borders set a trap for future generations.
It really is.
But it's not just Africa. There is a fascinating case study in the source material about the island of Hispaniola.
Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
Yes. I've actually looked at this border on satellite imagery before, and it's striking. You can literally see the border from space because the landscape is so different on any side.
It is one of the clearest visual examples of how colonialism creates lasting cultural and geographic destinies. Same island, same geography, same climate.
With 2 completely different worlds.
Because the island was split between 2 different colonial powers with 2 very different approaches. The West was controlled by France, and the East was controlled by Spain.
And the sources detail how those different approaches built entirely different societies.
Exactly. The French colony, which eventually became Haiti, was built on a brutal model of intense agricultural extraction. They imported roughly 500,000 enslaved Africans to work massive sugar and coffee plantations.
So it was highly populated, intensively farmed, and deeply exploitative.
Right. Meanwhile, the Spanish side, the modern-day Dominican Republic, used a different economic model. They focused more on extensive cattle ranching. They didn't import enslaved labor on the same massive scale.
So the demographics and the economy were fundamentally different from day one.
And that's the point. When both sides eventually fought for and won their independence, they weren't starting from the same baseline. The French and Spanish colonial systems had created two distinct political and cultural entities.
It really shows how colonial approaches do more than just draw a line in the dirt. They shape the modern state from the inside out,
They absolutely do.
which perfectly transitions us to the next phase the sources cover, redrawing the map, the era of independence.
Right, because eventually the empires weaken and nationalist movements rise up to challenge imperial rule.
And we've seen this happen in waves. The American Revolution in the 18th century, where 13 colonies became a sovereign state.
Or Algeria fighting a massive, grueling war to gain independence from France in 1962.
But the sources suggest that actually undrawing these colonial lines is incredibly painful. And the ultimate example of this is the partition of India.
Oh, the partition of India in 1947 is such a complex and tragic example of self-determination and map-making colliding.
Let's set the scene for you. After World War II, the British Empire is financially exhausted, and they are leaving the Indian subcontinent.
But you have this massive, sprawling territory with a highly mixed population. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and many other groups all living side by side.
And the dominant political thought at the time was tied directly to that nation-state ideal we talked about earlier. The leaders argued that these distinct groups couldn't peacefully coexist in a single massive state.
Right. The push was for self-determination, so the decision was made to split the region, to partition it. They would create a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan.
But the physical act of drawing that line,
It was reckless. The border, known as the Radcliffe Line, was drawn by a British lawyer who had never even been to India before, and he had just a few weeks to do it.
a few weeks to divide hundreds of millions of people, it's hard to even wrap your head around that.
And the consequence was catastrophic, because you can't just draw a clean line on a map when the populations are deeply intertwined.
Right. The sources highlight that this wasn't just lines on paper. The moment that border was announced, it triggered one of the largest mass migrations in human history.
Millions of people suddenly realized they were on the wrong side of the new border. Hindus in newly formed Pakistan fleeing toward India, and Muslims in India fleeing toward Pakistan.
And the violence that erupted during that migration was horrific.
It was immense suffering. Upwards of 1 million people died. It serves as this incredibly grim reminder of the difficulty of untangling populations to fit an idealized map.
Self-determination is a powerful force, but achieving it geographically is often deeply traumatic.
It is rarely a peaceful parade.
And this fracturing of the map didn't just stop in the mid-20th century. We are still dealing with these forces today. Which brings us to a concept the text calls devolution.
Devolution, yes.
It sounds like a sci-fi term like evolution in reverse, but it's actually a very specific political strategy.
It is. Devolution is the transfer of power from a central government down to regional or local authorities.
So it's a way for a state to hold on to its sovereignty by giving up a little bit of control.
Exactly. It's a pressure valve. When a central government sees a region pushing hard for self-determination, they might offer them autonomy instead of full independence.
To keep the country together.
Right. A great modern example is the United Kingdom. Scotland has a very distinct national identity. So to ease the pressure of Scottish nationalism, the UK government devolved power. They created a Scottish parliament.
So Scotland gets to control its own education, healthcare, local laws.
But the UK retains ultimate sovereignty over things like defense and foreign policy.
Spain is trying a similar balancing act with Catalonia, right?
Yes, granting regional autonomy to keep the broader Spanish state intact. But devolution is a risky game.
Because it can be a slippery slope.
Exactly. Sometimes it works as a pressure valve, but other times it just whets the appetite. You give a region a taste of self-rule, and it becomes a stepping stone to a full breakup.
And when that central authority weakens too much, the breakup can be spectacular. Which leads us to the biggest example of this in our lifetimes, the collapse of the Soviet Union.
1991, the ultimate modern example of the map completely shattering.
It is still wild to me how fast it happened. You had this massive superpower, this giant block on the map, and it just dissolved.
It was a cascade effect. After World War II, the USSR had strict control over a vast territory and numerous satellite states. But by the 1980s, the economy was faltering and political tensions were boiling over.
And crucially, the Soviet Union was a state, but it was absolutely not a nation.
Right. It was an empire holding together dozens of distinct nations: Ukrainians, Georgians, Kazakhs, Lithuanians.
So when the central authority in Moscow started to weaken, and they tried granting a bit more autonomy to save the system,
The centrifugal forces just took over. The desire for self-determination tore the entire structure apart. The Soviet Union collapsed and birthed 15 newly independent states almost overnight.
But as dramatic as the Soviet collapse was, the sources point to a different case study from the 1990s as the ultimate tragedy of the nation-state ideal.
Yugoslavia.
Yeah, this is a heavy one.
It is. The breakup of Yugoslavia is a terrifying look at what happens when the drive for a pure nation-state turns violent.
So how did Yugoslavia even come together in the first place?
It was created after World War I. The mapmakers essentially lumped several rival ethnic groups into one state: Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes.
So right from the start, it's a highly volatile mix of different nations forced into one state container.
Yes, and it was held together for decades, largely by the iron fist of a dictator, Josip Broz Tito. But after he died, and as the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union next door was falling apart, all those old ethnic tensions exploded.
The 1990s.
Right. The various groups all wanted self-determination. They wanted their own nation-states.
But just like we saw with India, the populations in Yugoslavia were completely intermixed. You had Serbs living in Croatia, Croats and Serbs living in Bosnia.
And this is where the dark logic of the nation-state takes over. If your goal is to have borders that perfectly match your ethnic group, but the people are mixed together, what do?
You force them out.
You do. Under leaders like Slobodan Milosevic, we saw the horrific rise of ethnic cleansing. It wasn't just a war over territory, it was a systematic campaign to terrorize and remove rival ethnic groups from specific areas.
To forcibly clean the map.
Exactly, to physically create the demographic reality needed to justify a new state.
The human toll was just staggering.
It fractured the country entirely. The process of Balkanization broke Yugoslavia down into smaller states like Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, North Macedonia.
States that more accurately reflected the ethnic makeup. But the cost of redrawing those lines was mass atrocities.
It's the absolute worst-case scenario of political geography.
So when we zoom out and synthesize everything from today's source material, it really shifts how you look at the world. The map is just an ongoing tug of war.
It is a constant struggle between the desire for control, which is sovereignty, and the desire for identity, which is self-determination, and the nation-state ideal.
And whenever you open a news app and see a border dispute or a separatist movement or a territorial war, it is almost guaranteed to be these exact forces grinding against each other.
They are the tectonic plates of global politics.
So I have to ask you this, and this is maybe a provocative thought to leave you all with. If self-determination is the ultimate goal for these groups, and true nation-states are as rare as we discussed.
Are we finished drawing the map?
Exactly. Are we done?
I don't think we are, not by a long shot. There are still hundreds of stateless nations out there, groups with distinct identities who feel they are ruled by outsiders.
And given the precedents of the Soviet Union collapsing and Yugoslavia fracturing,
we might just be living in a temporary lull. We look at the map today and think it's settled because the major borders haven't shifted drastically in a couple of decades.
But historically speaking, a couple of decades is nothing.
It's the blink of an eye. The pressure for self-determination hasn't gone away. It's just building up beneath the surface. I wouldn't be surprised if the map our grandchildren study looks profoundly different.
The next great fracturing of borders.
Wow. Well, I am definitely going to look at that classroom map a little differently next time.
It's never a finished puzzle.
Thank you for helping us decode the chaos today. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the lines you see, and we will catch you next time.